Good morning, and welcome to First Church Unitarian. My name is Larry Kaylor, and I am a member of I have the honor of serving on our standing committee. I'd like to give a special hello to our YouTube and Zoom viewers. We are always so glad to have you with us. Just have a couple of reminders today. One is that after the service, we have our annual meeting, and that will be here in the sanctuary and on Zoom, but not YouTube, and that will be at 11:30. Another reminder is if you have a nomination for Keeper of the Flame, please get that in by the end of the day this Wednesday, the 24th. Thank you. I always encourage you to take a good look at your Community Matters newsletter. You find it in your order of service, and you might even get it online in our listserv distribution. And that is a way to keep up with all the things that are going on in this rich church. So please join us for fellowship after the service. Mostly you know the routine. Just follow everyone through the doors and down the stairs and to the back and have some coffee with us and refreshments. And if you're new, it's a good place to get to know us better. Now please silence your cell phones, and we will have a reading of the Warrant, followed by a magical mystery tour with the Beatles.
Hi, I'm Ann Donald, your clerk. First, the voting list is now available on our website as well as posted at the church. I am notifying you, the members of First Church Unitarian, that you are lawfully entitled to vote in its affairs, to meet in person in the sanctuary or on a Zoom call. The link will be provided after church services on May 21st at 11:30 a.m. following the Sunday service, and a brief social time to act on the following articles. First, to review and accept the members' minutes from the October 23, 2022 warranted meeting. Second, to hear and act upon the 2022 to 2023 annual report. Third, to elect officers of First Church Unitarian and nominating committee members. Fourth, to act upon the proposed budget for July 2023 through June 2024. Fifth, to authorize the treasurer to borrow money on behalf of the church. Sixth, to transact any other business that may lawfully come before said meeting. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ann Donald, your clerk. First,
The magical mystery tour is hoping to take you away. Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. Yet you may see the meaning of within. Love is all, and love is everyone. Try to realize it's all within yourself. No one else can make you change. And to see you're really only very small, and life flows on within you and without you. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. The words of Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison, let us worship. I'd like to invite Tucker to come up and light our chalice this morning. And as Tucker lights our chalice, please join me in saying the words of our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Thank you. Good day, sunshine. Welcome. I join with Larry in welcoming you here to First Church Unitarian in Littleton, Massachusetts. Excuse me, my name is Lara Hoke, pronouns she, her, and I'm so happy and lucky to be the minister serving this incredible congregation. If you're new with us here this morning, a special welcome to you. If you're here in the sanctuary with us for the first time, I hope that you will, as Larry said, follow us out to the vestry after the service for some coffee and fellowship. If you're new with us online, welcome to you too. And if you haven't already, please check out the website fculittle.org. And there you can find out a lot of information about us and ways to contact us if you wish. It is great to be together on this beautiful day. I've been looking forward to this service. About once a year, we have a question box or Ask the Minister Sunday. And we had one last spring. And one of the questions that you asked was, what is it that makes the Beatles so special? And I knew I wouldn't have a quick answer for it. So, and I also knew I wanted to get Molly in on the act, our wonderful musical director. So we today are finally going to try to answer that question the best we can in the length of a service. What makes the Beatles so special? So enjoy the music, and we'll start off with a second Beatles song for you today. Our opening song to sing, Here Comes the Sun. I invite you to rise in body or spirit.
I'm on.
You're on? I'm on.
So, time for all ages. When it was actually October of 1972, my family moved across the country from California to Pennsylvania, and everything was turned upside down. And somehow I have very vivid memories of right after we moved to Pennsylvania, even though I was really young. I remember specifically October 29th, 1972, because it was the day before I turned 4. And I watched this incredible thing on the television with my family. It was this cartoon movie called Yellow Submarine. And my whole family wanted to watch it. And there were these 4 really cool, charming hero characters who had these funny accents. And they broke into song, and I loved the music. And then at the end, they appeared in the flesh for a minute, and I was in love. Smitten, hooked for life, a day short of 4.
Well, you're going to know I'm a lot older than Laura because I saw Yellow Submarine in the movies. And at the end, there's this little bouncing ball where everyone sings together, and it was so much fun. The whole audience was singing. But today we're going to show you a clip that Laura you did a great job, by the way. She put together this really good clip. And it's about the Nowhere Man. And I love the Nowhere Man, also known as Jeremy. And you know why I love him so much? Because he's super creative. He thinks about everything. He's curious, so curious about the world. He's filled with love. And sometimes he just feels like he doesn't fit. And that's something I think we all relate to. And yet, he is amazing.
So let's see what you guys think. And at the end, anyone who wishes to is welcome to sing along.
Hey, lads, look at this. What?
About once a month, this congregation has a Share the Plate Sunday. And on this Sunday, we give our offering plate to a wonderful nonprofit organization. So this month, our special organization is NAMI of Central Middlesex, and here to tell you all about it is our own Patti Sardella.
Hi, I'm Patti Sardella. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm here to talk to you about NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and our local affiliate, Central Middlesex, as our Share the Plate recipient this month. NAMI is our country's largest grassroots mental health organization. It's dedicated to building better lives for people living with mental illness and health conditions, and fighting the stigma that plagues our society. Most of you know that my wonderful son David has schizoaffective disorder, which is schizophrenia and depression combined. Sometimes life just isn't easy, but very few things compare with watching your child's life disintegrate until she or he cannot be recognized as the person they were before. But my experience with the ravages of David's mental illness led me to NAMI. It wasn't David that needed help at this point, it was me. NAMI's Family to Family class teaches us what mental illness is, how it works in the brain, the types of mental illnesses, symptoms, treatments, hallucinations, delusions, the mental health care system, crisis management, family dynamics, talking to police, and a lot more. Family to Family is a comprehensive and intense 8-week class. I learned everything listed above, but the most important thing I learned was how to let go. I couldn't live David's life for him or make decisions for him. I couldn't make him learn to take his medicine. And prior to Family, didn't even know how to talk to him. By learning to let go, David and I no longer had anything to fight about. It set us free. Free to love each other and be a loving family again. You can't imagine how good that feels. NAMI's main goals are to educate, support, and advocate. They offer classes and support groups designed for adults, children, and affected individuals. But there are a few things unique to Central Middlesex to take note of. NAMI Central Middlesex has created some unique and essential community outreach offerings, distinguishing Central Middlesex as a leader among NAMI affiliates. The first is Emerson Behavioral Health Resource Lists. Emerson Hospital is teamed up with Central Middlesex in an effort to widen the scope of NAMI's outreach. Providers are equipped with NAMI informational flyers to give to patients if the need is there. This cooperative effort includes crisis help and information, locating mental health providers, criminal justice involvement, substance use supports, veterans supports, and so much more. Another program is the Faith Community and Mental Health Forum. Often people dealing with mental health challenges turn to a faith leader for support. Not me. Panelists on this forum include clergy members and individuals with mental health conditions active in their faith communities. Yet another Central Middlesex innovation are called crisis cards. Crisis cards list crisis response offerings in Massachusetts, such as the new 988 suicide hotline. Crisis cards decrease the number of 911 calls and lower the number of ER mental health visits. But all of these efforts require financial support. NAMI showed David and I a way to be together as a family again, peacefully and with mutual love and respect. I strongly believe NAMI Central Middlesex deserves all the financial support we can give. Please donate as much as you feel you can to an organization worthy of these donations, and with the ingenuity and knowledge required to fight mental illness and, the most importantly, fight the stigma. More information on NAMI Central Middlesex can be found on their website, namicentralmiddlesex.org. Please make checks out to NAMI Central Middlesex. If you are watching from home and would like to donate, please mail a check to NAMI Central Middlesex, P.O. Box 2793, Acton, Mass. 01720. Thank you.
Thanks, Patti. Any cash or change left in the plate will go directly to NAMI Central Middlesex, or you can write a check out to NAMI Central Middlesex if you wish. This morning's offering for NAMI Central Middlesex will now be given and received in grateful appreciation. Please join with me in the words of our community response. We are grateful for the opportunity to give and serve, and grateful for the gifts we have received. May this affirm the ministries of our church community, both within and beyond these walls. As you've heard, the Beatles and I go way back to when I was just turning 4. Of course, by 1972, the Beatles had already been broken up for a couple of years, but the breakup was still fresh, and there was that ever-present hope then that there would be a reunion. Naturally, when one thinks of the Beatles, the first thing one thinks about is music. That makes sense, but when I think about the magic of the Beatles, it's their personalities that loom just as large. Both their manager, Brian Epstein, and their producer, George Martin, recognized that there was raw musical potential there, even in those very early days, particularly the songwriting and singing of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But both Epstein and Martin said that it was ultimately their personal charm that won them over and made them want to take a chance on this somewhat unusual group. They were unusual in part because they did write most of their own songs. They were unusual because there was no obvious frontman or leader. Yes, in the early days, John was the internal leader of the band, but on stage, it was all of them, just as they were, playing instruments and singing. It was part of the genius of Epstein and Martin that they decided to leave them that way, even though marketing-wise, there was some pressure to pick a figurehead and market around him. They knew that wouldn't work with the band dynamics, so they left them just as they were, and that was a wise, wise decision that seems obvious only in hindsight. Sometimes you just have to leave it alone. When you look at the early Beatles, when they're giving interviews, they're always cracking jokes and smiling, laughing. They clearly had lots of inside jokes too. They made each other giggle constantly. Could have been some marijuana involved in that as well. But even when they were performing in those early days, it was all smiles. No guitar face, none of that. They made it look really fun to just be up there and play and sing. There was a huge rise in the number of people who played guitar following the Beatles coming to the fore. After the Beatles, who could resist a guitar? They're relatively cheap, they're portable, and the Beatles made it look so amazing. I've heard countless rock stars who came after the Beatles say that they were the ones that inspired them to take up a guitar and play. And I can say it was the Beatles who made me want to play. And when I was 13, my father took me to get my first guitar. Thank you, Dad. I wonder how many of you took up guitar in part because of the Beatles. I'm sure a few of you. They made it look so fun. And whenever you saw them together, and I can't think of another band quite like this, you wanted to be their buddy. You wanted to be hanging out with them. You wanted to be a part of that. It was the charisma, the charm. The music was enchanting, but there was more. Musically, the Beatles were more than the sum of their parts. And that's saying something, because when you take each of the 4 of them, there is a lot of talent there, any way you look at it. But together, there was something even greater. There was this mysterious alchemy to the group. When the Beatles first came to America in that first wave of Beatlemania in early 1964, they were arriving in New York City just a couple of months after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Americans needed some cheering up, and the Beatles did their part. The Beatles had grown up loving 50s rock and roll music from the United States. Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, those were their favorites. But by the early 60s, rock and roll was starting to fade in the United States. There were more family-friendly pop stars coming to the fore. The number 1 song the last week of December 1963 on the Billboard charts was a song called Dominique by a Belgian singing nun. Really. The number 2 song that week was by Bobby Vinton, There, I've Said It Again was the song. And Bobby Vinton and the Singing Nun kind of went back and forth, number 1 and 2, through through December, and into January 64. The first week of February 1964, the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand was number 1. By the first week of April 1964, a couple months later, the Billboard top 5 songs were, in order, Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. Beatles had the top 5 songs. Rock and roll, not pop, but rock, was back. And as some commentators have noted, the Beatles brought back rock and roll to America, and Americans reacted as though they were hearing it for the first time. Part of what makes the Beatles so special, in my estimation, is that they magically, almost mystically, capture the amazing decade that was the 60s. They were so in step with the zeitgeist of the 60s that it's legitimately hard to tell sometimes if the Beatles were starting a trend or early on in following one. For starters, of course, as we've talked about, they helped to kick off the cultural 1960s in the first place, shaking us out of the crew cuts and Brill cream and other 50s sensibilities. When the Billboard charts a little bit into the 60s, like by 65, were starting to reflect some thoughtful folk music by the likes of Bob Dylan, the Beatles were right in step, putting out more acoustic-oriented, folksy albums of their own, with lyrics that were becoming more than just romantic love songs. Or, like Dylan, romantic love songs with darker twists, like the Beatles' Norwegian Wood. By 1966 and the album Revolver, the Beatles were trending psychedelic. And the next year, in time for the Summer of Love in '67, they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What a trajectory. The Beatles had an incredible trajectory as swift and spectacular as the 60s themselves, from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 3 years. Remarkable. They broke up just a couple years after that. It was a candle lit at both ends. I'd like to pause now to share a brief video, about 4 minutes long, to give you a sense of that trajectory, and then I'll invite Molly to share a few remarks.
Oh man, I just want to talk and talk and talk. Hi, I'm Molly Lozeau. I'm your music director. I wonder how many of you remember that I'm also a professor. I teach at St. Anselm College. I teach piano lessons, I teach chamber music, and I also teach history of rock and roll, and so we spend a lot of time covering all of this. And I just wanted to say I'm very happy to be here, and I've worked in a UU church since 2008, and I've never spoken, so this is a first for me. I'm very excited, and oh my gosh, I could just talk like for the rest of the day about the Beatles, but I won't. I just want to say that I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Beatles' music, but I'm also going to talk about their connection that they had with each other and other people, and the collaboration that they had as well. I find that plays a big role in their success and what I enjoy about the Beatles too. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about me and why I love the Beatles and why they're meaningful to me. My first memory of listening to the Beatles, I was probably 8 or 9. I'm not exactly sure. I was sitting in my dad's brown Chevy van on very hot seats, I remember, and we had been listening to Rubber Soul. And one of the songs on Rubber Soul is Michelle, and there's a line in there where Paul sings some French, and I remember I was like singing it all wholeheartedly, and my dad's like, no, those aren't the words. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean those aren't the words? And I remember him getting out a piece of paper and a pencil, and he's writing down the French words for me and telling me how to pronounce them, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. I don't know, it's just like a very random early memory, right? I ended up taking that tape from my dad and listening to my room over and over and over. I have to say to this day, Rubber Soul is my favorite album, probably because I heard it so much. You know, I think that really stuck with me. And if you know anything about the Beatles' progression, and we kind of saw it up here, Rubber Soul landed in early 1965. So it was kind of in the middle of everything. It was at the beginning of their transition into like a heavier, more experimental sound. So we still had some lighthearted pieces, and they started to branch into more interesting musical things. My favorite song is "In My Life," which has an amazing piano solo played by their producer, George Martin, who Reverend Lara mentioned already. And that was like one of my goals. Was to be able to play it. I started playing piano around that time. I was like almost 10 when I started playing piano, and I'm like, I have to be able to play that solo. And it's very hard. But that was one of my goals. So yeah, around that time, I started really getting into the Beatles, listening to that album. And it kind of corresponded with when the anthologies came out. That was in 1998. I don't know if you remember watching the Beatles anthology. I don't know what station it was on, but it was a cable station, and we didn't have cable, but my grandparents had cable. And so I remember my grandma inviting me over to watch it, and this hours-long documentary that starts right from the beginning of the Beatles and goes all the way through their end. I think when it came out, it was probably on like 12 VHS tapes, and then they released DVDs, and they were like 6 DVDs, something. It was a long documentary series. I watched the whole thing. My grandma also videotaped it off the TV, so I could watch it over and over and over again. And I feel like in 1998, I was 14. And so those were like formative years, right? Those are the years where I was really getting into music. I had started playing piano. I was really loving the Beatles. And I thought, like, looking back on it, it's really interesting for me to see that my family really supported me in all of my music making and all of my nerdiness, like wanting to listen to the Beatles 24/7. That's all we listened to in the car, right? That's all we listened to. And then when the tapes came out, the Beatles anthology CDs and the cassette tapes with all the different takes of their songs, that's all we listened to. Thank you, parents, for indulging me. But I think that goes to show, like, I don't know, the connection that they had with their fans, even though, again, this is the 90s. They no longer existed. But for me, they were like fresh, right? It was exciting music to listen to. It was new music to listen to for me. And again, like having that correspond with me learning how to play piano. I saved up and bought like the complete Beatles sheet music collection, and so I was playing the songs on my keyboard. I was making medleys. I would go, spend 10 cents a page at the library, photocopy a song, cut it all up, tape it together. I have several medleys of my favorite songs that I would play over and over. I also had a little Yamaha keyboard that had like fake drums that you could program, and like you could make 2 tracks, and I would make recordings of Beatles songs. I even brought one into my 8th grade class, and we listened to it. Like, I don't even know. But again, like, the Beatles couldn't exist alone, and I couldn't exist as a musician alone, right? I needed that inspiration. I needed the drive to like practice something. I've always liked classical music, but being able to play songs that I knew, like Beatles songs, and be encouraged by my parents and my grandparents to do that was really exciting, and it was really like formative for me, to have that encouragement. And I wanted to make a connection with that the Beatles wouldn't have been the Beatles if not for the connections and collaborations that they had as well. Reverend Lara mentioned their manager, Brian Epstein. She also mentioned George Martin, their producer. Especially once we get to the mid-Beatles. She talked a little bit about Sgt. Pepper and that album, and why it was so revolutionary. And if you don't have a concept of what that album is, I highly recommend you go and listen to it. You can find all of the recordings on YouTube. And you can also find some music videos as well, and those are all really fun, as you saw from some of the clips that we had already. But Sgt. Pepper was their first concept album. The concept was that they were kind of sick of being the Beatles. They didn't want to be touring anymore. They wanted to send another band on tour for them, essentially, and this was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But what made this album interesting is not just the music, which is all amazing and all very diverse, was the resources that the Beatles had in George Martin, their producer, and also the head sound engineer named Jeff Emmerich, who, again, you've probably never heard of, but he's essential to the sound of this album. He had the idea to kind of connect the songs together with applause, make it sound like it's a live album. He also helped out with some of the strange noises. If you know Strawberry Fields, which wasn't on the album but was recorded at the same time, there's some backwards noises, there's some backmasking of some of the singing and of some instruments. If you know the album, we have Within You, Without You, which Reverend Laura quoted a lot of for the opening words. It has all of these interesting Indian instruments and strings and all these noises. And again, this engineer, Jeff Emmerich, helped pull all of this together. I have to say real quick, the Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite at the very end, it's like a jumble of carnival sounds. It's just a fun story. He and George Martin took recordings of all of these random sounds, cut them up into short pieces and threw them up in the air and taped them all back together. And you get this weird mashup of a whole bunch of different sounds. And again, that wasn't the Beatles, right? That was their engineers and their producers helping them out. And so again, that album couldn't have been what it was without the people helping out the Beatles. Of course, they had the main ideas for the songs, but the idea of putting it all together as a package and making it an art album has so many people. Oh my gosh, I could just keep talking about that, but I'll stop. I'm gonna go back to my notes. I haven't even looked at my notes. I could just talk about that. So after that, I wanted to also talk a little bit about the end of the Beatles, which you saw up there. The last clip that we saw, they were singing on a rooftop. The Beatles were singing illegally on top of their recording studio because they were working on a film. And if you have Disney Plus, I recommend you check out Get Back, which is a 3-part film made by Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame. And it documents this film that the Beatles were trying to put together while they were recording Let It Be in 1969. But it's just full of arguments and fights and creative clashes. And George Harrison actually quit. Spoiler alert. George Harrison quit the band. He left for a couple days. He was sick of Paul being kind of a jerk and bossing everybody around, and he walked out. And they ended up talking to him, and he came back, and they decided to keep recording, but then it was all scrapped. There is no Let It Be film, really. Just because it never really gelled. It never came together. The one good thing we got out of that was that awesome concert where they actually wanted the police to come and arrest them and take them away to jail because it would be a great ending to the film. That didn't quite happen. The police did shut it down after a while. But anyway, I wanted to point that out because Let It Be was the second to last album that they recorded. And then they recorded Abbey Road, which Carl is wearing the album cover today. You should look at Carl. It's the Beatles walking across the crosswalk. And I think if you know that Abbey Road was the last album recorded, it means so much more. It's such a beautifully crafted album. And if you listen to it against Let It Be, you can hear they actually have different sound producers. It's very different. By the time we got to the end of the 60s, the Beatles' manager had died, and they were having arguments about who they wanted to be their manager, so that was a point of contention. George Martin was also getting sick of their attitudes and the way that they wanted to experiment and not use him as much, so he said that he would help them with Abbey Road if they could do it like they used to, which is collaborating together, which is enjoying each other's company, which is not being mean, essentially, being respectful and getting back to the music. So again, another album I recommend you listen to is Abbey Road. It's just so nice and refreshing after we get through Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, the White Album, all of those later Beatles you start to see a lot of individual personalities coming through and music styles. But Abbey Road is a conglomeration, a beautiful collaboration of the Beatles getting back to their sound, really. And they did it very well. You know, they did it very respectfully. And then the record company decided to release Let It Be. They're like, we have all these songs that are recorded. We need to make more money. Let's release Let It Be. So it kind of, I don't know, marred the legacy of the Beatles coming together, because then we hear this overproduced, horrible album. Sorry if you like it, but again, third recommendation, you should listen to Let It Be Naked, which is all of the overproduction stripped away and back to the Beatles songs. I'll make a post or something. The 3 albums that you should listen to is Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, and Let It Be Naked, all right? But anyway, I feel like the only reason the Beatles could come together and make an album like Abbey Road is by acknowledging the people that they needed to collaborate with, including themselves, right? Including their producer. And I feel like that took a lot of respect. After this happened in 1970, Paul McCartney sued the band to get out of the Beatles. They were all kind of at the edge where they wanted to just do their own thing, but in order to like actually resolve it, it had to be a lawsuit, which is very sad. And I think that also kind of mars the idea of the Beatles are going to get back together. And it's like, no, they all had very successful careers after the Beatles. But that's totally another talk. I just want to finish and kind of wrap this up by saying that again, the Beatles couldn't have been the Beatles without their connections and collaborations. I couldn't be the musician that I am today without my connections and collaborations. And I think if you stop for a minute and think about your life, you know, I'm sure you can think about some connections and collaborations that you've had that mean a lot to you. And I think part of that goes to like acknowledging those people, right? There are a lot of times there are what I call behind the scenes people in your life. You know, the people that have influenced you one way or another or have encouraged you no matter how small. And I think it's good to, you know, stop and reflect on that every once in a while. I'm going to end with a quote that Reverend Lara has said already, and this is the last line in the last song in their last album, Abbey Road. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. I wish you had a little more enthusiasm for the...
Oh my goodness.
We're blessed that not just the Fab Four part of your musical journey, but that FCU is part of your musical journey, so thank you so much. You know, it reminds me too, hearing Molly's words, another magical thing about the Beatles is the crossing of the generations. The Beatles were part of the silent generation. The generation that made them big was the big baby boomer generation. But then Gen X came along to love them, the millennials came along to love them, and I was wondering about the younger generations, and then I saw that one of our kids had on a Beatles t-shirt. So, you know, it just seems to carry through the generations. A few more points to wrap it up. Lennon, McCartney, the songwriting team, was at the heart of it. Yes, George Harrison and Ringo Starr wrote some songs and were a big part of the band's sound for sure, but John and Paul wrote the vast majority of the songs and the hits. You might know that they had an agreement to put both of their names on their songs, even if they didn't write it together but wrote it individually, as happened more and more as the years went on, as Molly alluded to. But the Beatles, John and Paul especially, were great foils for each other. I've always thought of them as the perfect yin and yang. Think of John as that mysterious, sometimes cynical yin, and Paul as the more outgoingly, seemingly upbeat yang. The perfect example of that dynamic in the songwriting would be Paul would start off with a song, "It's getting better all the time," and then John would chime in, "It couldn't get much worse." Or John would come in with a nearly finished masterpiece like "A Day in the Life," reflecting on the news of the day, the sad, poignant news of the day. I read the news today, oh boy. And the song needed a break in the middle, and so Paul comes in with this song fragment. He had this breathless, happy, up-tempo, woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. And somehow it worked. They had this balanced partnership of mutual respect. It felt like they enchanted each other almost. They were each other's muse as much as anything. And I think part of the deep bond of John and Paul was that as teenagers, both of them lost their mothers. John's mother was a pedestrian in a fatal drunk driving accident, and cancer took Paul's mother. So they had that deeper bond, too. And though they inevitably grew up and grew apart, the oldest Beatles, Ringo and John, were 29 when the band broke up, and Paul and George were 27. They really were like brothers, and the love always comes through in the music, even during their harder times at the end. George Harrison, the baby of the band, wrote some songs here and there during the Beatles' years. His first few efforts were just okay, not really on par with John and Paul, but they added some flavor. But his music got better and better, and he did bring a lot of world music flavor to the Beatles, an important contribution, playing that sitar riff and Norwegian wood. And so that interest in Indian music for George went back even to 1965. Famously, you might know the Beatles had this big, long trip to India in 1968, which had a profound impact on them, as trips to India tend to do. And George, of course, followed the Hindu spiritual path for the rest of his life. John and Paul had a more humanistic bent in their lyrics, occasionally some earth-centered appreciations in there, occasional nods to their Christian pasts. But George brought Eastern religion and Eastern religious flavor into the mix and added interesting depth with that. It added that much more mystique to the band as well. And on the last album they created, Abbey Road, as Molly noted, I would argue that George's two songs on that album, Here Comes the Sun and Something, are the very best songs on the whole LP. They hold up as well as anything else off that album or off of any Beatles album, really. And so for me, it's inspirational that there on that last album, George came through in such a big way. It's inspirational that the quiet one, the overlooked one, had these hidden depths of talent. And it's a reminder that in a funny way, talent is contagious. Being close to people who push themselves to create or rise to the top of their abilities can make you rise higher yourself. It's that rising tide that raises up all the ships. So hang out with talented, creative people when you can, people who push themselves, because it'll push you too. And sometimes all you need to tap into your own potential is that push of being around someone who lets you know that it can be done, even by that kid you grew up with. There's no end to provocative things that have been said about the band. I'll share just one to close. Author Kurt Vonnegut wrote, I say in speeches that a plausible mission of artists is to make people appreciate being alive at least a little bit. I am then asked if I know any artists who pulled that off, and I reply, the Beatles did. And indeed, the Beatles make it just a little bit better to be alive, and I hope today's service makes you appreciate being alive just a little bit more, too. Here's to big dreams, to catching lightning in a bottle, to love, to joy. Blessed be, and amen. Our closing song is Let It Be, and I invite you to rise in body or spirit. We'll have some more help from Eric Semple.
Thank you so much. For our closing words, if you're comfortable, I invite you to hold hands to the person next to you if they're comfortable as well, or touch shoulders, elbows, feet, whatever works for you, or simply raise your hand or your arm and feel the energy between us. I'd like our closing words to be a cooperative benediction. I invite you to share words that come to you in this moment, whether they're your own words or words of the Beatles.
Take a sad song and make it better.
I get by with a little help from my friends.
And
Tell me, you've heard every word, but you haven't heard me.
Together we're better. I want to hold your hand.
Michael, would you enable Zoom sound?
yes, folks from Zoom, if you want to throw in words as well. I need to laugh, and when the sun is out, I've got something I can laugh about.
Mr. Moonlight.
I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in.
Give peace a chance. Love is all you need. May the inspiration, the talents of others help you to rise as well. May your collaborations be respectful and fruitful. And may you love life just a little bit more because of the music you love. And may you help the people you know to love life just a little bit more too. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. Please be seated.
Cuckoo-ca-choo. So why don't we take an opportunity to say hello to everybody at home on that camera right there. Hello, everybody. We'll see you back here at 11:30, this same Zoom channel, this same Zoom station.